I was 19 years old when I became a gunner on a 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft mount aboard the USS Laffey, a Fletcher-class destroyer operating off the coast of Okinawa in April of 1945, and nothing in my 6 months of training at Great Lakes Naval Station had prepared me for what it actually meant to stand behind that gun and watch planes deliberately fly straight at you with no intention of pulling up. My name was Thomas Keller. I was a seaman first class, and I had joined the Navy because I thought it would be safer than the Army, which shows you how much an 18-year-old kid from Iowa knows about war. The Bofors was a Swedish-designed gun that fired 40mm high-explosive rounds at a rate of about 120 rounds per minute, and when you're operating it correctly with a good crew, you can put enough metal in the air to shred anything made of aluminum and fabric, but that requires everyone to do their job perfectly while planes are diving at you loaded with bombs and fuel. The Laffey had been on station in the waters around Okinawa since early April, providing fire support for the Marines and soldiers fighting their way across that miserable island, and we'd already survived 2 kamikaze attacks in the previous weeks that had damaged our forward gun mounts and killed 3 men in the forward crew compartments. Our captain, Commander Frederick Beckton, was a thin, intense man from Texas who had survived the sinking of a previous destroyer and seemed to have a personal vendetta against every Japanese pilot in the Pacific, and he ran the ship with the kind of discipline that kept us alive even when the odds said we shouldn't be. I was assigned to Mount 43, which was the portside aft 40mm Bofors, and my gun captain was a gunner's mate second class named Robert Martinez from New Mexico, who had been in the Navy since 1942 and had seen action at Guadalcanal and the Philippine Sea. Martinez was the kind of sailor who could field strip and reassemble a Bofors in the dark, and he drilled us constantly on loading procedures and tracking techniques until we could do it without thinking, which turned out to be exactly what we needed when the thinking part of your brain shuts down and pure training takes over. The morning of April 16th started like most mornings on picket duty off Okinawa, which meant we were exhausted from standing watches through the night, eating powdered eggs that tasted like cardboard, and constantly scanning the sky for the black dots that meant someone was coming to kill us. The sea was relatively calm that morning, which was unusual for April in those waters, and there was a haze on the horizon that made it hard to distinguish between clouds and aircraft at distance, which was exactly the kind of weather the Japanese preferred for their attacks. We had been at general quarters since 0400, which meant we'd been at our battle stations for almost 6 hours when the first radar contact came in around 0930, and by that point, my legs were already aching from standing on the metal deck and my hands were cramping from gripping the training wheels on the gun mount. The announcement came over the ship's intercom system in that metallic voice that always made bad news sound even worse, informing us that radar had picked up multiple bogies inbound from the north at low altitude. Estimated time to visual contact was 10 minutes, and all gun crews should prepare for surface action. Martinez immediately started running through our pre-engagement checklist, which we'd done so many times it was almost like a prayer, checking that the ammunition hoists were functioning, that the loaders had fresh clips ready, that the gun's hydraulic system was at proper pressure, and that the rangefinder optics were clean and calibrated. Our crew consisted of Martinez as gun captain, myself as the primary pointer controlling elevation, a guy named Danny Walsh from Boston as the trainer controlling traverse, 2 loaders named Johnson and Kowalski who fed the 4-round clips into the gun, and a talker named Peters who maintained communication with the Combat Information Center below decks. We'd been together as a crew for almost 3 months, and we'd developed the kind of wordless coordination that comes from doing the same dangerous task over and over until it becomes almost automatic. But there was always that moment before contact when you could see everyone's hands shaking just a little bit, and you knew they were all thinking the same thing you were thinking, which was whether this would be the attack that finally got through our defenses. The first visual contact came at 0942, when the forward lookouts spotted a formation of aircraft coming in low over the water from the northwest, and from our position on the aft gun mount, we could see them as tiny black specks against the grey sky that gradually resolved into the distinctive shapes of Japanese aircraft. The combat air patrol fighters that were supposed to be protecting us were engaged with another group of kamikazes about 10 miles to the east, which meant we were on our own for this attack, and you could feel the tension on the ship ratchet up another notch as everyone realized we were about to earn our pay. The Japanese were using a mix of aircraft types for their kamikaze attacks by this point in the war, everything from obsolete fixed-gear dive bombers to frontline Zero fighters, and they would typically come in waves with the faster planes trying to draw our fire while the slower bomb-laden planes followed behind looking for an opening. Our Bofors could track and engage aircraft out to about 4,000 yards if the visibility was good, but the effective range where you could actually expect to hit a maneuvering target, was more like 2,000 yards, which gave you maybe 15 to 20 seconds of firing time before the plane either crashed into the sea, disintegrated from your fire, or hit the ship. The engagement began at 09:47, when our forward 5-inch gun mounts opened fire on the leading aircraft, and the distinctive crack boom of the 5-inch guns was followed almost immediately by the hammer-like reports of the 40mm Bofors all along the ship's sides as the planes closed to effective range. Martinez was calling out ranges and bearings based on the information coming from Peters through the sound-powered phones, and I was working the elevation wheel to keep the gun pointed at the target Martinez had designated, which was a Nakajima B-6N torpedo bomber that was coming in at about 150 feet above the water on a direct course for our port beam. The first burst from our gun went high because I was anticipating the plane's climb, but Martinez corrected me with a sharp command to lower the elevation, and the second burst caught the plane's left wing, and you could see pieces of aluminum skin peeling away from the impact points as the high-explosive rounds detonated. The pilot tried to correct his course, but he was already losing control, and the plane yawed hard to the left and went into the water about 500 yards off our port side, throwing up a massive plume of white spray that was still hanging in the air when the next plane came into our engagement envelope. The second plane was a Zero fighter that was moving significantly faster than the torpedo bomber, and it was coming in from a steeper angle that suggested the pilot was going for a direct dive into our superstructure rather than trying to hit us at the waterline. This was actually better for us in some ways because a steeper approach gave us more time to track the target and more opportunities to hit it before it reached the ship. But it also meant that if we didn't stop it completely, the impact would be more devastating because of the additional kinetic energy from the dive. I tracked the Zero as it descended through about 3,000 feet, leading it by what felt like the right amount based on its speed and angle, and Martinez gave the command to fire when it crossed into our range. The Bofors started hammering out rounds with that distinctive chunking sound that you felt in your chest as much as heard, and the tracers arced up toward the target in a stream of red fire that seemed to converge on the Zero's engine cowling. We got lucky with that one because something in the engine or fuel system must have been hit in the first few rounds, because suddenly there was a bright orange flash and the whole front half of the plane seemed to come apart in mid-air, and then it was tumbling out of control and impacted the water about 300 yards from the ship without ever coming close to hitting us. The third and fourth planes came in almost simultaneously from different angles, which was exactly the kind of coordinated attack that the Japanese had been developing to overwhelm individual ships' defenses, and this was where having multiple gun mounts all working together became absolutely critical. Our mount engaged the plane coming from the port quarter, while the starboard aft mount took the one coming from the starboard beam, and there was a brief moment where I lost track of which tracers were ours and which belonged to the other gun, as the sky filled with streams of 40mm fire. The plane we were tracking was another torpedo bomber, and it was coming in even lower than the first one, probably not more than 50 feet off the water, which made it a harder target because we had to be careful about depressing the gun too far and putting rounds into the ocean. Martinez kept feeding me corrections as I walked the fire toward the target, and I could see our rounds stitching a pattern across the water that moved closer and closer to the plane until finally they began hitting the fuselage and wings. The pilot kept coming even as pieces of his plane were being blown off, which was either incredible courage or incredible fanaticism, depending on how you want to look at it, and he got to within about 200 yards before the accumulated damage finally caused the plane to break apart and cartwheel into the sea in a mass of flames and spray. By this point, we'd been shooting continuously for almost 5 minutes, which doesn't sound like a long time until you're the one standing at a gun mount with your heart trying to pound its way out of your chest while your hands work the controls and your eyes burn from staring at the sky and the cordite smoke that's drifting back across the mount from the gun muzzle. Johnson and Kowalski were working like machines to keep the ammunition clips feeding into the gun, and you could see the empty brass shell casings piling up on the deck around the mount, still hot enough to burn you if you stepped on them wrong. The fifth plane appeared through the smoke and haze, and this one was a Judy dive bomber that was already in its attack dive when we first spotted it, which meant we had maybe 10 seconds to engage before it released its bomb or crashed into us. I cranked the elevation wheel as fast as I could to track the steep angle of descent, and Martinez was shouting bearing corrections because the plane was moving across our field of fire as it dove, and Walsh was spinning the traverse reverse wheel to keep us pointed in the right direction as the three of us worked together to put the gun on target. We opened fire when the Judy was at about 2,000 feet and descending at what looked like a 60-degree angle, and our first burst missed completely because I had misjudged the lead angle, but the second burst caught the tail section and you could see the fabric control surfaces shredding under the impact of the high explosive rounds. The pilot must have been killed or lost control because the plane suddenly rolled hard to the right and the dive angle became even steeper and it went into the water about 100 yards from the ship with an impact that sent up a geyser of white water that rained back down on our deck like a tropical cloudburst. The Combat Information Center reported that we had splashed 5 planes in as many minutes, which would have been cause for celebration under normal circumstances, but Peters was relaying a new message that radar had picked up a second wave of contacts inbound from the northeast, and this group was much larger than the first, with an estimated 16 aircraft in a coordinated attack formation. The brief respite we had while we waited for the second wave to arrive was almost worse than the actual combat, because it gave you time to think about what was coming and to realize how exhausted you already were and how many more planes we were going to have to shoot down before this attack was over. Martinez used the time to have Johnson and Kowalski bring up more ammunition from the magazine below decks and to check the gun's cooling system because the barrel was already hot enough that you could see heat shimmer coming off the metal. The other gun crews along the ship's sides were doing the same thing, and you could see the fatigue and tension in everyone's faces as we prepared for what the captain was calling over the intercom the largest coordinated kamikaze attack he had seen in his entire career. Commander Beckton was giving orders to the helmsman to begin evasive maneuvers, which meant the ship would be turning and changing speed constantly during the attack to make us a harder target to hit, and this added another layer of complexity to the gunnery problem because we would have to constantly adjust our aim to compensate for the ship's movement as well as the plane's movement. The second wave appeared on the horizon at approximately 1000 hours, and even from several miles away you could see that this was different from the first attack because the planes were arranged in a loose formation that suggested coordination and planning rather than just individual pilots making suicide runs. The Combat Information Center's count of 16 aircraft turned out to be accurate, and they were a mix of types including Zeros, Judys, Vals, and even a couple of Betty bombers, and they were coming in from multiple directions simultaneously in what was clearly designed to split our defensive fire and create openings for some planes to get through. The captain ordered all gun mounts to engage targets of opportunity and to prioritize the planes that were on the most direct intercept courses with the ship, which meant that we couldn't afford to waste ammunition on planes that were still several miles out and might be taken down by other ships or fighters before they reached us. The engagement began with the 5-inch mounts opening fire on the planes that were still at longer range, and within seconds, the entire ship was vibrating from the recoil of the main battery guns, and the sky ahead of us started filling with black puffs of smoke from the time-fused shells that were detonating among the incoming aircraft. Our Bofors mount was assigned to defend the port quarter sector, and Martinez had identified 3 planes in our zone that were on approach vectors that would bring them within range in the next 2 minutes. The first was a Zero, coming in fast and low from the northwest. The second was a Val dive bomber approaching from due west at medium altitude, and the third was another Zero that was hanging back at longer range but appeared to be timing its run to arrive just after the first 2 planes. We engaged the first Zero at about 2,500 yards, which was at the outer edge of our effective range, and the initial bursts were more about establishing a barrier of fire that might discourage the pilot or get lucky with a hit than about precision gunnery. The pilot was good and was jinking his plane in unpredictable patterns that made it difficult to maintain a solid track, but we kept firing and walking the tracers toward his flight path until finally we got a solid hit on the starboard wing root that caused the wing to fold upward and the plane to snap into an uncontrolled roll. The Zero went into the water about 800 yards from the ship, and we immediately shifted fire to the Val dive bomber that was now descending toward us from about 1,500 feet altitude. This pilot had already committed to his attack dive and wasn't maneuvering, which made him an easier target but also meant he was closing the distance faster, and we had less time to put enough rounds into him to bring him down before he either released his bomb or crashed into us. I was cranking the elevation wheel as fast as my arms would move to track the steep dive angle, and the Bofors was firing continuously as we poured rounds into the descending bomber, and you could see chunks of the plane being blown off with each burst, but it kept coming. The Val released its bomb at about 500 feet altitude, which was too high for the bomb to be accurate, but suggested that the pilot knew he was going to be shot down and wanted to at least get the ordnance off before he died. The bomb missed the ship by about 50 yards and detonated in the water off our port beam, sending up a column of water and spray that washed across our deck, and the Val itself disintegrated under our fire about 3 seconds later and scattered pieces of burning wreckage across the water. The third Zero that had been hanging back chose that moment to begin its attack run, and it was coming in at wave-top height at maximum speed, which is the most difficult type of target to engage because you have almost no time to track it, and if you miss your first shots, you probably won't get another chance. Martinez was calling out the range as the Zero closed. 2,000 yards, 1,500 yards, 1,000 yards, and I could hear the tension in his voice as he realized we were running out of time, and Walsh was traversing the gun to follow the Zero's track across our field of fire, and the loaders were slamming clips into the gun as fast as they could to keep up the rate of fire. We opened up at about 900 yards, and the stream of tracers reached out toward the Zero like a fiery rope, and the pilot was so low that our rounds that missed the plane were hitting the water and sending up geysers of spray that looked like depth charges going off. We hit the Zero repeatedly across the fuselage and engine cowling, and I saw pieces of the cowling peeling away and dark smoke starting to stream from the engine, but the pilot kept coming, and he was now close enough that I could actually see him in the cockpit through the gun sight, just a dark figure hunched over the controls. The Zero was at about 300 yards when something critical in the engine finally gave way, and the whole nose section seemed to crumple, and the plane nosed down hard and hit the water in an explosion of white spray and burning fuel that was close enough that we felt the heat from the fireball. That was 6 planes down, but there were still 10 more in the attack, and the other gun mounts around the ship were all firing continuously at targets in their sectors, and the air was thick with the smell of cordite and hot metal and the sea spray that was being thrown up by the near misses and the crashing planes. Peters was relaying information from the Combat Information Center about planes approaching from other sectors, but we had to stay focused on our assigned zone and trust that the other gun crews were handling their targets. The next plane in our sector was a Judy dive bomber that appeared out of the smoke and haze at about 3,000 feet altitude, already in its attack dive, and coming down at a steep angle that was aimed almost directly at our aft superstructure, where the gun mount was positioned. This was the nightmare scenario we'd trained for, but hoped would never happen, because a plane diving directly at your position meant that if you didn't stop it completely, you were going to be directly in the impact zone. Martinez's voice was steady as he called out the range and gave firing commands, but I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I tracked the Judy's descent and tried to remember everything I'd been taught about leading a diving target. We opened fire at about 1,800 feet when the Judy was already committed to the dive and wouldn't be able to pull out even if the pilot changed his mind, and our first bursts went low because I wasn't leading the target enough, but Martinez corrected me, and the second burst walked right up into the Judy's belly. The plane kept coming even as we poured rounds into it, and pieces of aluminum skin and framework were being blown off and falling away, and I could see fuel streaming from ruptured tanks and leaving a dark trail in the air behind the plane. At about 800 feet, the Judy's engine caught fire, and the whole nose section was engulfed in flames, but the plane was still coming, and it was now close enough that I could see individual details, like the landing gear and the bomb still attached under the fuselage. We kept firing, and the Bofors was so hot now that you could see heat waves coming off the barrel, and Johnson and Kowalski were moving with desperate speed to keep the ammunition flowing, and finally at about 300 feet, the accumulated damage caused the Judy's wings to fail, and they folded back against the fuselage, and the whole plane came apart in mid-air, and the pieces tumbled past us and into the water off our starboard quarter with impacts that sounded like thunder. The Combat Information Center reported that we'd splashed 7 planes so far, and the ship's other gun mounts had gotten 5 more, which meant there were 4 planes still in the attack, and everyone was running low on ammunition, and the barrels on the Bofors were so hot that we were in danger of having a cook-off if we didn't watch the rate of fire carefully. The next plane appeared almost immediately, another Zero coming in from the port beam at medium altitude, and we engaged at about 2,000 yards and began the same deadly process of tracking and firing and correcting and firing again until either the plane went down or it hit us. This Zero's pilot was either wounded or his controls were damaged, because the plane was flying erratically and not maintaining a steady course, which actually made it harder to hit because you couldn't predict where it would be in the next second. We fired burst after burst at the weaving target, and finally one of our rounds must have hit something vital because there was a bright flash, and the plane seemed to explode from the inside, and the debris scattered across the sky and rained down into the ocean. The 13th plane was a Betty bomber coming in low and slow from the northwest, and it looked like it had already taken damage from another ship or from one of our combat air patrol fighters because one engine was smoking and it was flying with a noticeable list to starboard. The Betty was a big plane, and it would do tremendous damage if it hit us, but it was also a big target and it wasn't maneuvering much, so we had a good chance of stopping it if we could get enough enough rounds into it before it closed the distance. We opened fire at about 3,000 yards, which was at the extreme range for the Bofors, and the first bursts missed but served to establish the range, and then we walked the fire in until we were hitting the Betty regularly along the fuselage and wings. The Betty was tough, and it absorbed a lot of damage before it finally caught fire, and when it did go up it was spectacular, with flames engulfing the entire airframe and the bomb load cooking off and causing secondary explosions that blew the plane into pieces that scattered across a half-mile radius. That was 9 planes down in our sector, and the ship had gotten 4 more in other sectors, which meant there were 3 planes left from the original 16, and everyone was praying that those last 3 would be taken down by other ships or fighters before they reached us, because we were all running on empty, and the gun barrels were so hot they were starting to droop and the ammunition hoists were nearly depleted. But the prayers didn't work, because 2 of those last 3 planes got through all the defensive fire and made it to point-blank range with the ship. The first was a Zero that came in at wave-top height from the starboard bow, and it was moving so fast and was so low that our forward guns couldn't depress far enough to track it, and it flashed past our bow at a range of less than 50 yards, and I could see the pilot's face as clearly as I can see my own hand in front of me right now, and he was maybe 20 years old, and he looked absolutely terrified, but he had his plane under perfect control. The Zero pulled up hard as it passed the bow and went into a climbing turn that brought it up and over our superstructure, and we tracked it with the Bofors and fired what few rounds we had left, but the angle was wrong and the range was too close and our rounds went wide. The Zero leveled out at about 200 feet and then nosed over into a dive aimed directly at our aft deckhouse, and I thought this was it. This was how it ended, but at the last second, something happened to the plane's controls, or the pilot's nerve failed him, or maybe our rounds had damaged something critical after all, because the Zero rolled inverted and passed over our mast by what couldn't have been more than 10 feet and crashed into the water off our port side so close that the spray from the impact washed over us, and we were all soaked and choking on seawater. The last plane, the 16th plane, was a Judy dive bomber that had somehow made it through every layer of our defenses and was now in its final dive, aimed at our midship section, where the forward fire room and boiler room were located. Every gun on the ship that could bear was firing at this plane, including our Bofors, even though we had maybe 10 rounds left in the ready locker, and the sky was crisscrossed with tracers, all converging on this single target. The Judy took hit after hit, and pieces were being blown off, and you could see flames starting to stream from the engine, but it kept coming, and the bomb was still attached, and the pilot was still in control. At about 500 feet, the Judy released its bomb and then pulled up hard, trying to avoid hitting the ship, and the bomb came down and hit the port side of the forward deckhouse and penetrated into the ship before detonating with a blast that blew out all the portholes on that side and sent a column of fire and smoke up through the deck. The Judy itself, now without its bomb, and with its wings and tail shot nearly to pieces, passed over the ship at mast height and continued on for maybe another 100 yards before it finally broke apart completely and fell into the sea. The bomb explosion had killed or wounded about 15 men in the forward berthing area and had started a serious fire that took the damage control teams almost an hour to get under control, but the ship was still afloat and still operational, and we had survived an attack by 16 kamikazes, by shooting down 14 of them before they reached the ship, and by having enough luck that the 2 who got through didn't manage to sink us. The official action report that was filed after the battle credited the forward 5-inch gun mounts with 4 kills, the starboard gun mounts with 5 kills, and our port side gun mounts with 5 kills, which meant that our particular Bofors mount, Mount 43, had personally accounted for 5 of the 14 planes that were shot down. The rest of that day was a blur of damage control work and casualty care and trying to get the ship back into some kind of fighting trim while remaining on station, because the Marines and soldiers on Okinawa still needed our fire support and there weren't enough ships to go around. Martinez was in sick bay getting treated for burns on his hands from where he'd grabbed a hot shell casing during the fight, and Walsh was being checked for hearing damage because he'd been standing too close to the gun when it fired and the muzzle blast had been right next to his head, and Johnson had a piece of shrapnel in his leg from debris from one of the planes that had crashed close to the ship. I was physically intact, but I was shaking so badly that I couldn't even light a cigarette, and Peters had to help me get down off the gun mount because my legs wouldn't hold me up anymore. The Laffey stayed on station off Okinawa for another 6 weeks, and we survived 2 more kamikaze attacks during that time, but nothing like the attack on April 16th, and when the battle for Okinawa was finally over in June, we were ordered to Pearl Harbor for repairs and crew rest. The ship's official casualty count for the Okinawa campaign was 32 killed and 71 wounded, which meant that about a quarter of our crew had been killed or wounded during 3 months of combat. Martinez recovered from his burns and stayed with the ship, and Walsh got his hearing back partially but never completely, and Johnson's leg wound got infected and he was sent back to the States, and I never saw him again. Peters survived the war without a scratch and went home to Kansas and married his sweetheart, and I got a letter from him once in 1948, but then we lost touch. The USS Laffey was eventually decommissioned in 1947 and spent years in the reserve fleet before being brought back into service during the Korean War, and now she's a museum ship at Patriots Point in South Carolina, where people can walk her decks and see the gun mounts that we stood at during that attack on April 16th. I went to visit her once in 1992, almost 50 years after the battle, and I stood at Mount 43 and ran my hands over the gun's controls, and I could still feel the vibration of the gun firing, and I could still smell the cordite, and I could still see those planes coming at us with their pilots, who were so young and so scared and so determined to kill us that they were willing to die in the attempt. I've spent a lot of time thinking about those Japanese pilots over the years and trying to understand what would make someone climb into a plane with just enough fuel for a one-way trip and fly toward a ship full of men who were doing their best to blow you out of the sky before you could complete your mission. The easy answer is that they were fanatics who had been brainwashed by their government's propaganda, and maybe that's true for some of them, but when I think about that Zero pilot whose face I saw so clearly as he passed our bow, I remember that he looked terrified, and you don't look terrified if you're a fanatic who believes he's going to paradise. I think he was just a kid who'd been told that dying for his emperor was the only honorable thing he could do, and he was scared out of his mind, but he was going to do it anyway, because that's what his duty required. The thing about war that nobody really prepares you for is the guilt, and not necessarily the guilt about killing people, although that's there too, but the guilt about surviving when so many others didn't. I survived April 16th, 1945, because I was fast enough and skilled enough and lucky enough, and because Martinez trained our gun crew so well that we could function under impossible pressure, and because the Japanese pilots who were trying to kill us made small mistakes or had mechanical problems, or just ran out of luck before we did. But 32 men on the Laffey didn't survive, and hundreds of Japanese pilots didn't survive, and tens of thousands of Marines and soldiers and Japanese defenders on Okinawa didn't survive, and I don't know why I got to come home and they didn't. I carried that guilt with me through the rest of my time in the Navy, and through the decades after I got out, and it affected every relationship I had, and every decision I made, and there were years when I couldn't sleep without seeing those planes diving at us, and hearing the Bofors hammering and feeling the heat from the burning planes as they crashed into the sea. My first marriage fell apart because I couldn't talk about what I'd been through, and I couldn't explain why I would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, and it wasn't until I met other veterans at a VA support group in the 1980s that I finally started to understand that what I was feeling wasn't weakness or cowardice, but was a normal human response to surviving something that human beings weren't designed to survive. The official history books say that the Battle of Okinawa was the last major battle of World War II, and that it convinced the Allied leadership that invading the Japanese home islands would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties, and that this calculus was part of what led to the decision to use atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. I don't know if that's true or not, and I don't know if the men who made that decision were right or wrong, but I know that on April 16, 1945, I was 19 years old, and I stood behind a 40mm Bofors gun, and I watched 16 planes deliberately fly at my ship, intending to crash into it and kill everyone aboard, and I helped shoot down 14 of those planes before they could reach us, and the 2 that got through didn't sink us, but they killed and wounded dozens of my shipmates, and I've had to live with all of that for the rest of my life. The Bofors mount that I served on during that attack is still on the deck of the Laffey, where visitors can see it, and there's a plaque that describes the attack and lists the names of the men who were killed that day, and sometimes I wonder if any of those visitors understand what it really meant to stand at that gun while planes full of fuel and bombs came at you with nothing but determination and mathematics determining whether you lived or died. The mathematics said we should have been sunk that day. 16 coordinated kamikaze attacks against a single destroyer should have resulted in multiple hits and probably in the ship going down, but we beat the mathematics by being skilled and determined and incredibly lucky, and we paid for that survival with the lives of 32 men who didn't make it home. I'm 98 years old now, and I'm one of the last surviving members of the Laffey's crew from Okinawa, and in a few more years there won't be anyone left who remembers what it was actually like to be there on that morning when the sky filled with planes and the guns opened up and we fought for our lives and for our ship and for each other, the history books will still exist and the Laffey will still be there at Patriots Point for people to visit, but the living memory of what it felt like and smelled like and sounded like will be gone. And that bothers me more than I can express because I think people need to understand what war really is before they decide to start one. War isn't the way it looks in movies where the heroes always survive, and the action is exciting, and the deaths are quick and clean. War is standing at a gun mount for hours while your hands cramp and your legs ache and your heart pounds, and then having a few minutes of absolute terror where everything you've trained for is put to the test, and where a single mistake means you and everyone around you dies, and then if you're lucky you survive and you get to carry the weight of that survival for the rest of your life. The last time I visited the Laffey, I stood at Mount 43 for about 20 minutes just running my hands over the metal and remembering Martinez and Walsh and Johnson and Kowalski and Peters, and remembering the sound of the gun firing and the smell of the cordite and the sight of those planes coming at us, and I cried for the first time in probably 30 years, not because I was sad or traumatized or broken, but because I was grateful that I got to survive that day, and that I got to have a life and a family and 79 years that those 32 men on the Laffey and those 16 Japanese pilots never got to have. And because even though the guilt never really goes away, I finally made my peace with the fact that surviving wasn't something I should feel guilty about, but was something I should honor by living the fullest life I could and by telling the story so that maybe people will understand what we went through and why war should always be the last resort and never the first choice.